Homeless man refuses CEO's money. The next day, the CEO sees him in the boardroom. Hello, welcome, leave a like, subscribe, activate notifications, and enjoy this story. In the heart of a bustling city, where the line between wealth and poverty is razor thin, a brief encounter unfolds that will change everything. A powerful CEO, driven by success, reaches out with a casual gesture. A $50 bill to a homeless man on the street. But what happens next isn't just unexpected. It's unimaginable. The man looks up, his eyes filled not with gratitude, but with something deeper, something haunting. He refuses the money, and with a voice that cuts through the noise of the city, he says words that shake the CEO to his core. The next day, the CEO walks into a boardroom, ready to close a deal that will define his legacy. But as the door swings open, his world stops. Sitting at the table, dressed in a suit that doesn't quite match the memories of yesterday, is the same man he tried to help. And he's not here for charity. He's here to reveal a truth that will turn the CEO's life upside down. What could have brought this man from the streets to the heights of power in just one day? And what secret does he hold that could change everything? The rain fell relentlessly on the bustling streets of Manhattan, creating a somber symphony of droplets against umbrellas and hurried footsteps splashing through puddles. Amidst the sea of gray suits and black umbrellas, one figure stood out: Richard Thompson, CEO of Thompson Enterprises, striding purposefully down Fifth Avenue, his mind consumed by the multimillion-dollar deal he was about to close. His Italian leather shoes clicked against the wet pavement as he navigated through the crowded sidewalk, barely noticing the blur of faces around him. The weight of his upcoming meeting pressed heavily on his shoulders, but it was a familiar burden, one he had grown accustomed to over years of cutthroat business dealings. As Richard approached the corner of 53rd Street, something caught his eye, jarring him from his thoughts. Huddled against the wall of a towering skyscraper was a man, his weathered face partially hidden beneath a tattered baseball cap. The stark contrast between Richard's impeccable tailored suit and the man's threadbare jacket was a vivid reminder of the city's vast economic divide. For a moment, Richard hesitated. He rarely paid attention to the city's less fortunate, viewing them as mere background noise in the symphony of New York's success. But today, something made him pause. Perhaps it was the way the man's eyes, startlingly blue and clear, seemed to pierce through the gloom of the rainy day. Or maybe it was a fleeting memory of his own humble beginnings, long buried beneath years of ambition and success. With a slight shake of his head, Richard reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet. He extracted a crisp $50 bill, the kind of money he usually wouldn't think twice about spending on a quick lunch. Extending his hand towards the man, Richard offered the bill, a gesture that felt both foreign and vaguely uncomfortable. "Here," Richard said, his voice gruff and impatient. "Take this." The homeless man looked up, his gaze meeting Richard's. For a split second, something flickered in those blue eyes: recognition? Disappointment? Before Richard could process it, the man spoke, his voice unexpectedly firm and clear. "I don't need your money," he said, each word deliberate and weighty. "I need you to remember who you used to be." The words hit Richard like a physical blow, causing him to stumble back a step. His mind reeled, grasping for context, for understanding. Who was this man? How could he possibly know anything about Richard's past? For a moment, the busy street faded away, and Richard was transported back in time. He saw flashes of a younger version of himself, hungry, determined, full of dreams that went beyond mere wealth and status. He remembered the fire that once burned within him, the desire to make a difference, to build something meaningful. As quickly as it came, the vision vanished, leaving Richard standing there, his hands still outstretched, the $50 bill fluttering in the wind. The homeless man's eyes never left his face, seeming to search for something deep within Richard's soul. Shaken, Richard hastily shoved the money back into his pocket. Without another word, he turned and hurried away, his previously confident stride now unsteady and uncertain. The rain continued to fall, but he barely noticed it, his mind a whirlwind of confusion and long-buried memories. As he pushed through the revolving doors of his office building, Richard couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted. The homeless man's words echoed in his head, a persistent reminder of a part of himself he had long ago discarded in his relentless pursuit of success. In the elevator, surrounded by mirrors that reflected his outward appearance of power and control, Richard found himself unable to meet his own gaze. The face that looked back at him seemed suddenly unfamiliar, a mask he had worn for so long he had forgotten what lay beneath. Stepping out onto the executive floor, Richard was greeted by his assistant, her voice filled with urgency about the impending meeting. But her words barely registered. As he walked towards his office, every step felt heavier than the last. Closing the door behind him, Richard sank into his leather chair. The skyline of New York spread out before him like a kingdom he had conquered. Yet, for the first time in years, he felt no satisfaction in the view. Instead, a growing discomfort settled in his chest, a nagging feeling that something was terribly wrong. He reached for the phone, intending to call and postpone the meeting, but his hand froze midair. The choice before him suddenly seemed monumental: continue down the path he had carved for himself, or pause and confront the unsettling questions raised by a chance encounter on a rainy street corner. As the minutes ticked by, Richard sat motionless, torn between the life he had built and the haunting words of a stranger who seemed to know him better than he knew himself. Little did he know, this moment of indecision was just the beginning of a journey that would challenge everything he thought he knew about success, identity, and the true cost of ambition. Outside his window, the rain began to ease, the clouds parting to reveal a sliver of sunlight. But inside Richard's office, and within his heart, a storm was just beginning to brew. The following morning dawned clear and bright, a stark contrast to the previous day's gloom. Richard Thompson strode into the gleaming lobby of Thompson Enterprises, his composure restored after a restless night. He had managed to push the unsettling encounter with the homeless man to the back of his mind, focusing instead on the critical meeting that lay ahead. As he rode the elevator to the top floor, Richard mentally rehearsed his presentation. Today's meeting with international investors could propel Thompson Enterprises to new heights, cementing his status as one of Wall Street's most formidable players. The doors opened, and he stepped out, nodding curtly to his assistant. "The investors are already in the conference room, Mr. Thompson," she said, falling into step beside him. "There's been a slight change in the roster. A last-minute addition." Richard waved her off. "Details can wait. Let's not keep them waiting." With a deep breath, he pushed open the heavy oak doors of the conference room, a practiced smile already forming on his lips. But as his eyes swept across the faces seated around the polished table, the smile froze, then faltered. There, seated directly across from Richard's usual chair, was the homeless man from yesterday. Gone were the tattered clothes and unkempt appearance. In their place sat a man in an impeccably tailored suit, his silver hair neatly combed, those piercing blue eyes now framed by stylish glasses. The transformation was so complete that, for a moment, Richard doubted his own memory. The room fell silent, all eyes turning to Richard, who stood rooted to the spot. The man rose slowly, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Richard," he said, his voice as clear and commanding as it had been on the street corner. "It's been a long time." Richard's mind raced, searching desperately for context, for any memory that could explain this impossible situation. And then, like a bolt of lightning, recognition struck. "John," he managed to croak out. "John Henderson?" The name belonged to a ghost from Richard's past, a mentor he had betrayed years ago in his ruthless climb to the top. John Henderson had been more than just a business associate. He had been the man who saw potential in a young, directionless Richard, who had taken him under his wing and shown him the ropes of the corporate world. And Richard had repaid that kindness with betrayal, manipulating events to topple John from his position and seize control of what would become Thompson Enterprises. "I'm glad you remember," John said, his tone neutral but his eyes speaking volumes. "I believe we have some catching up to do." The other investors shifted uncomfortably in their seats, sensing the tension that crackled between the two men. Richard's assistant, standing by the door, looked bewildered, clearly unprepared for this turn of events. Richard's mind whirled with questions. How had John gone from the pinnacle of success to a homeless man on the streets? And more importantly, how had he managed to resurface here, now, in this crucial moment? With supreme effort, Richard composed himself, gesturing for everyone to take their seats. As he moved to his chair, he could feel John's eyes following him, those same eyes that had seen through him on the rain-soaked street. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard began, his voice only slightly betraying his inner turmoil. "It seems we have an unexpected addition to our meeting. May I introduce John Henderson, a former colleague." John nodded to the room, then fixed his gaze back on Richard. "More than a colleague, Richard. I'm here to discuss a potential partnership. One that I believe will be of great interest to everyone at this table." The word partnership hung in the air like a challenge. Richard's mind raced through possible scenarios, each more unsettling than the last. What game was John playing? Was this about revenge or something more? As Richard launched into his prepared presentation, he found himself stumbling over words that had been second nature just moments ago. His usual confidence wavered under John's steady gaze, which seemed to see through the carefully constructed facade to the uncertain young man beneath. The other investors sensed the shift, exchanging glances as Richard's polished veneer began to crack. John, however, remained impassive, occasionally nodding or jotting down notes, his very presence a silent accusation. As the presentation wore on, Richard felt as though he were standing on shifting sands. The empire he had built, the identity he had crafted for himself, suddenly felt precarious. With each slide, each figure he presented, a voice in the back of his mind whispered reminders of the choices he had made, the people he had stepped on to reach this point. And through it all, John watched, his expression unreadable, holding the power to unravel everything Richard had worked for with just a few words. As Richard concluded his presentation, a bead of sweat trickled down his back. The room fell silent, all eyes now turning to John Henderson. The moment stretched, taut with tension, as John slowly rose to his feet. "Thank you, Richard," he said, his voice carrying a weight that commanded attention. "That was certainly illuminating. Now, if you'll all indulge me, I have a proposal of my own to present. One that I believe will shed new light on the future of Thompson Enterprises." As John moved to the front of the room, Richard sank into his chair, a sense of dread settling over him. He realized, with crystal clarity, that his life was about to change irrevocably. The past he had tried so hard to bury had risen up to confront him, embodied in the man he had once betrayed. The stage was set for revelations that would shake the foundations of everything Richard had built. As John began to speak, Richard braced himself for the reckoning that was long overdue. The conference room, once a symbol of Richard's power and success, now felt like a courtroom where his past sins were about to be laid bare. John Henderson stood at the head of the table, his presence commanding and undeniable. The other investors leaned forward, sensing that they were about to witness something extraordinary. "Before I present my proposal," John began, his voice calm but filled with purpose, "I believe it's important to provide some context. A story, if you will, about ambition, mentorship, and the choices that shape our lives." Richard's hands clenched beneath the table, his knuckles turning white. He knew what was coming, yet felt powerless to stop it. John's eyes swept the room before settling on Richard. 15 years ago, I was where Richard sits now, at the helm of a thriving company, respected in the industry, and always on the lookout for fresh talent. The room faded away as Richard's mind was pulled back in time. He saw himself as he was then, young, hungry, full of dreams but lacking direction. The memory was so vivid he could almost smell the cologne he used to wear, could feel the nervous energy that used to course through his veins before big meetings. John continued, his words painting a picture for the riveted audience. "I met Richard when he was fresh out of college, bright, ambitious, but rough around the edges. I saw in him a reflection of my younger self, and I decided to take a chance." Richard remembered that first meeting, How in awe he had been of John. How desperately he had wanted to impress him. He recalled the moment John had offered him a junior position, the elation he had felt, the sense that his life was finally beginning. Over the next few years, I mentored Richard, John said, his tone tinged with a hint of nostalgia. I taught him everything I knew about business, about leadership, about integrity. He was a quick study, rising through the ranks faster than anyone I had ever seen. Images flashed through Richard's mind: late nights poring over reports with John, celebratory drinks after closing big deals, heartfelt conversations about the future of the company. He had idolized John, had wanted to be just like him. When had that admiration turned to envy? When had respect morphed into resentment? John's voice took on a harder edge. But success, as they say, can be a double-edged sword. As Richard's star rose, so did his ambition. And with that ambition came a willingness to cross lines that should never be crossed. The tension in the room was palpable. Richard could feel the eyes of the other investors on him, could sense their growing unease. He wanted to speak up, to defend himself, but the words stuck in his throat. 5 years into Richard's tenure with the company, we were on the verge of a major merger, John continued. A deal that would have secured the future of the company and everyone in it. But it wasn't enough for Richard. He saw an opportunity, not just for the company, but for himself. Richard's mind raced back to that time. He remembered the sleepless nights, the clandestine meetings, the careful manipulation of data and people. At the time, he had justified every action as necessary for success. Now, under the harsh light of John's words, those justifications felt hollow. Using inside information and a network of carefully cultivated allies, Richard orchestrated a takeover, John said, his voice steady but laced with old pain. He presented the board with fabricated evidence of mismanagement, turned key players against me, and in one fell swoop, took control of the company I had built from the ground up. A collective gasp went through the room. Richard felt as if he were watching the scene from outside his body, seeing the shock and disgust on the faces of the investors. He wanted to protest, to claim that John was exaggerating, but he knew every word was true. John paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle. Then, to everyone's surprise, a small, sad smile crossed his face. I lost everything. My company, my reputation, my sense of purpose. For years, I wandered, trying to make sense of what had happened, of where I had gone wrong. The room was silent, hanging on John's every word. Richard felt a strange mix of shame and fascination. He had never known what became of John after the takeover. He had deliberately avoided finding out, burying the guilt beneath layers of success and self-justification. It wasn't until I had lost everything that I truly found myself, John said, his voice taking on a tone of revelation. I discovered that there are more important things in life than power and wealth. I learned the value of human connection, of integrity, of leaving a positive mark on the world. As John spoke, Richard felt something shift inside him. The carefully constructed walls he had built around his conscience began to crumble. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to feel the full weight of what he had done. Yesterday, on a rainy street corner, I had a choice to make, John said, his eyes locking with Richard's. I could have ignored the man who had once betrayed me. I could have sought revenge. Instead, I chose to offer a chance at redemption, not just for Richard, but for the ideals this company was founded on. Richard's breath caught in his throat. Redemption? Was such a thing even possible after what he had done? John turned back to the investors, his posture straightening, his voice taking on a tone of determination. And that brings me to my proposal. A partnership, yes, but one built on transparency, ethical business practices, and a commitment to using our success to make a positive impact on the world. As John began to outline his vision, Richard found himself at a crossroads. The empire he had built suddenly felt empty, devoid of the meaning and purpose he had once dreamed of. John's words had cracked open a door to a different path, one that Richard had long ago abandoned. The choice lay before him, to cling to the power he had fought so hard to obtain, or to embrace the chance at redemption at becoming the man he had once aspired to be. As the presentation continued, Richard knew that his decision would shape not just his own future, but the lives of everyone connected to Thompson Enterprises. The past had been revealed, laying bare the foundation of lies and betrayal upon which Richard's success was built. Now, in this unexpected moment of truth, the future hung in the balance, waiting to be written. As John Henderson concluded his presentation, a heavy silence fell over the conference room. The investors sat stunned, their eyes darting between John and Richard, trying to process the shocking revelations and the ambitious proposal that followed. Richard Thompson, once the picture of corporate confidence, now sat rigid in his chair, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. For Richard, time seemed to stand still. The weight of his past actions, laid bare before his peers and potential partners, pressed down on him like a physical force. He could feel the eyes of everyone in the room boring into him, waiting for his response. This was a crucible moment, one that would define not just his future, but the future of Thompson Enterprises. John's voice broke through the tension. "I believe we should take a short recess," he suggested, his tone professional but tinged with understanding. "I'm sure we all need a moment to digest this information." As the investors filed out, murmuring among themselves, Richard remained seated, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. John lingered by the door, his eyes meeting Richard's. There was no triumph in his gaze, no vindictiveness, only a quiet challenge and, surprisingly, a glimmer of hope. Once alone, Richard stood on shaky legs and moved to the floor-to-ceiling windows. The New York skyline stretched out before him, a vista he had once viewed as a testament to his success. Now, it felt like a stark reminder of the moral compromises he had made to reach these heights. His reflection stared back at him from the glass, a man he hardly recognized anymore. The ambitious young protege he once was seemed like a stranger, as did the cutthroat businessman he had become. Who was he now? And more importantly, who did he want to be? A soft knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. It was Sarah, his assistant, her face etched with concern. "Mr. Thompson? Are you all right?" Richard turned, attempting to compose himself. "Sarah, I need you to clear my schedule for the rest of the day, and get me everything you can find on John Henderson's activities over the past decade." As Sarah nodded and retreated, Richard turned back to the window. He had a decision to make, perhaps the most important of his life. Should he fight to maintain his position, using every ruthless tactic at his disposal to discredit John and preserve his empire? Or should he consider John's offer of partnership and redemption, risking everything he had built but potentially regaining something he hadn't realized he'd lost, his integrity? The hours ticked by as Richard pored over the information Sarah had gathered. Reports of John's philanthropic work, his mentorship programs for underprivileged youth, his advocacy for ethical business practices, all painted a picture of a man who had found purpose beyond profit. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the city, Richard made his decision. He picked up the phone and dialed a number he thought he'd never use again. "John, it's Richard. We need to talk." 30 minutes later, John Henderson stepped back into Richard's office. The two men regarded each other silently for a moment, years of history hanging between them. Richard spoke first, his voice hoarse with emotion. "I've spent the day thinking about your proposal, about our past, about the kind of man I've become." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "I won't lie to you, John. A part of me wants to fight this with everything I have, to protect what I've built, regardless of the cost." John nodded, his expression neutral. "And the other part?" Richard sighed deeply. "The other part? The part I've been ignoring for too long. Knows that you're right. What I've built, what I've become, it's not what I dreamed of when I was young. When you first took me under your wing." A flicker of the old warmth passed between them at the memory. Richard continued, "I'm not sure I can be the man I was before. Too much has happened. But I want to try. I want to make things right." John's posture relaxed slightly, a cautious optimism in his eyes. "That's all I'm asking for, Richard. A chance to make things right, and not just between us, but for everyone this company touches. Richard nodded slowly. I'm willing to consider your partnership proposal, but I need assurances. This company, for better or worse, is my life's work. I can't just hand over control. I'm not asking you to, John replied. What I'm proposing is a true partnership. Your business acumen combined with my focus on ethical practices and social responsibility. Together, we could transform Thompson Enterprises into a model for corporate integrity. As they began to discuss the details, Richard felt a weight lifting from his shoulders. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with challenges both personal and professional. He knew that implementing John's vision would mean facing hard truths, making difficult changes, and possibly losing some of the fair-weather allies he'd accumulated over the years. But for the first time in a long time, Richard felt a spark of the idealism that had driven him in his youth. The prospect of building something truly meaningful, of leaving a positive legacy. It stirred something in him he thought had died long ago. As the night wore on and the outline of their partnership took shape, Richard realized he had taken the first step on a journey of redemption. It wouldn't be easy, and there would be many more crucial decisions ahead. But as he looked at John, at the man he had once betrayed and who was now offering him a second chance, Richard knew he had made the right choice. The New York skyline twinkled beyond the windows, a silent witness to this moment of transformation. For Richard Thompson, it was not just the dawn of a new business venture, but the beginning of a personal renaissance. The road to redemption had begun, and with it, the promise of a legacy built on more than just profit. A legacy of integrity, compassion, and positive change. As the first rays of sunlight crept over the Manhattan skyline, Richard Thompson stood in his office, his eyes fixed on the city awakening below. The events of the past 2 days had shaken him to his core, forcing him to confront long-buried truths and make decisions that would alter the course of his life and career. The partnership with John Henderson was now official, but the real work was just beginning. Richard took a deep breath, steeling himself for the challenges that lay ahead. He knew that transforming Thompson Enterprises wouldn't be easy, especially when it meant confronting the very practices that had made the company so successful. A knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. It was Sarah, his assistant, looking uncharacteristically nervous. "Mr. Thompson," she began hesitantly, "the board members are requesting an emergency meeting. They've heard rumors about the new partnership and the proposed changes." Richard nodded grimly. He had expected resistance, but not this quickly. "Schedule it for this afternoon," he instructed. "And Sarah, could you ask John to join us as well?" As Sarah left to make the arrangements, Richard's phone buzzed with a text from John. "Heads up, our old friend Carter is rallying opposition. Be prepared." Richard's jaw clenched. Robert Carter had been his right-hand man for years, helping him navigate the cutthroat world of corporate takeovers and backroom deals. If Carter was turning against him, it meant the battle for the soul of Thompson Enterprises was about to get ugly. The hours leading up to the board meeting were a flurry of activity. Richard and John huddled together, strategizing how to present their vision to a potentially hostile audience. Meanwhile, whispers and sideways glances followed Richard wherever he went in the office. The atmosphere was thick with tension and uncertainty. As 3 p.m. approached, Richard and John made their way to the main conference room. The board members were already seated, their faces a mix of confusion, anger, and curiosity. Robert Carter sat at the far end, his usual smirk replaced by a look of cold determination. Richard cleared his throat, preparing to speak, but Carter beat him to it. "Before we begin," Carter said, his voice dripping with false concern, "I think we need to address the elephant in the room. Richard, there are some troubling rumors circulating about a radical shift in company direction. Care to explain?" All eyes turned to Richard. He could feel the weight of their expectations, their judgment. For a moment, he was transported back to that rainy street corner, faced with a choice that would define him. But this time, he knew exactly who he wanted to be. "Gentlemen," Richard began, his voice steady and clear, "what you've heard is not just a rumor. Thompson Enterprises is indeed embarking on a new path, one that combines our business acumen with a renewed commitment to ethical practices and social responsibility. A murmur rippled through the room. Carter's eyes narrowed dangerously. "And to help guide us on this journey," Richard continued, gesturing to John, "I've brought in a partner whose expertise in these areas is unparalleled. Many of you may remember John Henderson." As Richard introduced John and began outlining their vision, he could see the board members' reactions ranging from intrigued to openly hostile. Carter, in particular, seemed to be seething, his face growing redder with each passing minute. Finally, Carter erupted. "This is absurd," he shouted, slamming his hand on the table. "You're talking about dismantling everything we've built. All for what? Some misguided notion of corporate responsibility? We have a responsibility to our shareholders, to maximize profits." The room erupted into chaos, with board members arguing amongst themselves. Some sided with Carter, while others seemed cautiously supportive of the new direction. John stepped forward, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the turmoil around him. "Gentlemen, please," he said, his voice cutting through the noise. "What we're proposing isn't the dismantling of Thomson Enterprises. It's evolution, adaptation to a changing world where consumers and investors alike are demanding more from corporations." As John spoke, Richard watched the room carefully. He could see doubt creeping into the eyes of some of Carter's supporters. But Carter himself was far from convinced. "This is nothing but a thinly veiled takeover," Carter spat, pointing an accusing finger at John. "And you, Richard, have you lost your mind? Or has your conscience finally caught up with you?" The words hung in the air, laden with implication. Richard felt a flash of anger, but also a deep sense of shame. Carter knew all the skeletons in his closet, every underhanded deal, every ethical line they had crossed together. For a moment, Richard was tempted to fall back into old patterns, to fight fire with fire and bury the opposition in whatever way necessary. But then he caught John's eye, saw the quiet strength there, and made his choice. "You're right, Robert," Richard said, his voice quiet but firm. "My conscience has caught up with me, and it's telling me that this change is long overdue." The room fell silent, all eyes on Richard as he continued. "I won't deny the success we've had, but at what cost? To ourselves, to others, to the very communities we operate in. It's time we do better. Be better." As Richard spoke, he could see the shift in the room. Some board members nodded in agreement, while others looked thoughtful. Even a few of Carter's staunchest allies seemed to be wavering. But Carter himself was far from swayed. As the meeting adjourned, he approached Richard, his voice low and menacing. "This isn't over, Thomson. You may have won this round, but mark my words, I'll fight this every step of the way. And I'm not the only one who thinks you've lost your edge." As Carter stormed out, Richard exchanged a glance with John. They had won the first battle, but the war for the soul of Thomson Enterprises was far from over. The tension that had been building was now out in the open, threatening to tear apart everything Richard had built. As they left the conference room, Richard couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to get much, much worse before they got better. The path to redemption, he was learning, was fraught with obstacles, and some of the biggest challenges were yet to come. The weeks following the tumultuous board meeting were a whirlwind of activity at Thomson Enterprises. Richard and John worked tirelessly to implement their new vision, facing resistance at every turn. The tension in the office was palpable, with employees and executives alike unsure of where they stood in this new paradigm. On a crisp autumn morning, Richard arrived at the office earlier than usual, hoping to get a head start on the day's challenges. As he stepped off the elevator, he was met with an unusual sight: a crowd of employees huddled around the reception area, their faces a mix of shock and concern. "Mr. Thomson," Sarah called out, her voice strained. "You need to see this." She handed him a tablet open to a breaking news article. The headline made Richard's blood run cold. "Thomson Enterprises implicated in massive financial scandal. CEO Richard Thomson named as key figure." As Richard skimmed the article, his heart raced. The piece detailed a complex web of offshore accounts, tax evasion schemes, and fraudulent business practices, all allegedly orchestrated by Richard himself. What made it worse was that many of the accusations were true, remnants of his past that he had thought long buried. "John," Richard muttered, pulling out his phone. But before he could dial, John burst out of the elevator, his face grim. "I saw the news," John said, pulling Richard aside. "This is bad, Richard. Really bad." As they retreated to Richard's office, the gravity of the situation began to sink in. This wasn't just a PR nightmare. It was a potentially company-ending crisis. And worse, it threatened to derail all the progress they had made towards reforming Thompson Enterprises. "We need to get ahead of this," Richard said, pacing the room. "Issue a statement, call our lawyers." "It's not that simple," John interrupted, his voice heavy. "Richard, look at the byline of that article." Richard glanced back at the tablet, and his heart sank even further. The exposé was written by none other than Melissa Chun, an award-winning investigative journalist who happened to be John's estranged daughter. "You knew about this?" Richard asked, his voice a mix of disbelief and anger. John shook his head, his eyes filled with a pain Richard had never seen before. "I knew Melissa was working on a big story, but I had no idea. Richard, you have to believe me. I didn't put her up to this." The revelation hit Richard like a physical blow. He slumped into his chair, his mind reeling. How did she get this information? Some of these details. Only a handful of people knew about them. Before John could respond, Richard's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Told you this wasn't over. Enjoy the spotlight, Thompson. R.C. Robert Carter." Of course, Richard should have known Carter wouldn't go down without a fight. But to leak confidential information to the press? That was a new low even for him. As the day progressed, the situation spiraled further out of control. The company's stock plummeted, clients began pulling out of deals, and the board was calling for an emergency meeting to discuss Richard's future with the company. In the midst of the chaos, Richard found himself facing the biggest moral dilemma of his career. He could fight the accusations, use his considerable resources to discredit the story and protect his position. It would mean reverting to his old tactics, possibly even implicating others to save himself. Or he could come clean, admit to his past transgressions, and potentially lose everything he had worked for. As evening fell, Richard stood at his office window, watching the city lights flicker to life. John approached, placing a hand on his shoulder. "What are you thinking?" John asked softly. Richard turned, his face etched with the weight of his decision. "I'm thinking about that day on the street corner," he said, "about second chances and redemption. And I'm wondering if this is the price I have to pay for the man I used to be." John nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Whatever you decide, Richard, I'm with you. But remember, true redemption isn't about escaping consequences. It's about facing them and choosing to be better." As they stood there, the city buzzing below them, Richard felt a strange sense of calm wash over him. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with challenges he couldn't even imagine. But for the first time in his life, he felt ready to face those challenges with honesty and integrity. "Call a press conference," Richard said, his voice steady and resolved. "It's time I told the truth. All of it." John squeezed his shoulder, a mix of pride and concern in his eyes. "Are you sure about this? There's no going back." Richard nodded, a small, sad smile on his face. "I'm sure. It's time to stop running from who I was and start becoming who I want to be." As John left to make the arrangements, Richard turned back to the window. The city stretched out before him, a testament to ambition and progress. But now, he saw it differently, not as a playground for the powerful, but as a community he had a responsibility to. The road ahead would be difficult, possibly even devastating. But as Richard prepared to face the consequences of his past, he felt a glimmer of hope. This crisis, as painful as it was, might just be the catalyst for true change, not just for Thompson Enterprises, but for Richard himself. Little did he know, this was just the beginning of a series of revelations that would shake the very foundations of his world and test his newfound commitment to integrity in ways he could never have imagined. The following days unfolded like a fever dream for Richard Thompson. The press conference, hastily arranged in the wake of the scandal, became a media circus. Cameras flashed and reporters shouted questions as Richard stepped up to the podium, John Henderson a steady presence by his side. "Good evening," Richard began, his voice wavering slightly before finding its strength. "I stand before you today not as the CEO of Thompson Enterprises, but as a man who has made grave mistakes and is ready to face the consequences." What followed was a confession that sent shockwaves through the business world. Richard laid bare the unethical practices he had employed over the years, the corners cut, the people stepped on in his relentless pursuit of success. He didn't spare himself, nor did he implicate others to lessen his own culpability. As he spoke, Richard could see the myriad of reactions in the room. Some reporters furiously scribbled notes, their eyes wide with the enormity of the story unfolding before them. Others wore expressions of disgust or disappointment. In the back of the room, Robert Carter stood with his arms crossed, a smug smile playing on his lips. But it was one face in particular that caught Richard's attention. Melissa Chen, John's daughter, sat in the front row, her pen poised over her notepad, her eyes never leaving Richard's face. There was something in her gaze, not triumph or vindication, but a complexity of emotions that Richard couldn't quite decipher. As the conference drew to a close, Richard made a final statement that would set the tone for the tumultuous days to come. "I don't ask for forgiveness," he said, his voice firm. "What I ask for is the opportunity to make amends, to use the resources and influence of Thompson Enterprises not for personal gain, but for the betterment of our community and the world at large." The aftermath was immediate and intense. The company's stock, already reeling from the initial exposé, plummeted further. Clients and partners distanced themselves, unwilling to be associated with the scandal. The board of directors called for Richard's immediate resignation. But amidst the chaos, something unexpected began to happen. Emails and messages started pouring in from employees, shareholders, and even members of the public, expressing support for Richard's honesty and his commitment to change. It wasn't universal by any means, but it was enough to give Richard hope that all might not be lost. As the days wore on, Richard found himself navigating a minefield of legal challenges, PR nightmares, and internal power struggles. Robert Carter, emboldened by the scandal, made a play for control of the company, rallying those who saw Richard's new direction as a threat to their bottom line. It was during this time that Richard's resolve was tested most severely. Late one night, as he pored over legal documents in his dimly lit office, he received a visit from an unexpected source. "Mr. Thompson?" A voice called from the doorway. Richard looked up to see Melissa Chun standing there, a tentative expression on her face. "Ms. Chun," Richard replied, gesturing for her to enter. "I must admit, I'm surprised to see you here." Melissa stepped into the office, her posture tense. I wanted to talk to you, off the record." What followed was a conversation that would change everything. Melissa revealed that her investigation had uncovered far more than what she had published, including evidence that implicated Robert Carter and several board members in activities far more egregious than anything Richard had confessed to. "Why are you telling me this?" Richard asked, his mind reeling from the implications. Melissa's eyes met his, filled with a mixture of determination and something akin to respect. "Because I believe in second chances," she said softly, "and because I think you might be the only one who can make this right." As Melissa left, leaving behind a USB drive filled with evidence, Richard felt the weight of responsibility settle even more heavily on his shoulders. He now held in his hands the power to bring down those who sought to destroy him, but using it would mean returning to the very tactics he had vowed to leave behind. The dilemma gnawed at him as dawn broke over the city. When John arrived at the office, he found Richard still at his desk, his face haggard but his eyes clear. "We have a problem," Richard said, gesturing to the USB drive, "and an opportunity." As Richard filled John in on Melissa's visit and the explosive information she had provided, he could see the conflict playing out on his friend's face. The evidence could save their vision for the company, could expose the true extent of the corruption they were fighting against. But using it would mean engaging in the same kind of underhanded tactics they had sworn to leave behind. "What are you thinking, Richard?" John asked, his voice heavy with the weight of the decision before them. Richard stood, walking to the window to look out at the city awakening below. The path ahead was fraught with ethical landmines, each step threatening to undermine the very principles they were fighting to uphold. "I'm thinking," Richard said slowly, "that the hardest test of integrity isn't in confessing past sins. It's in choosing to do the right thing when the wrong thing could save everything you've worked for." As the sun rose higher, casting long shadows across the office, Richard and John stood in silence, the USB drive between them a physical manifestation of the moral crossroads they faced. The decision they would make in the coming hours would not only determine the fate of Thomson Enterprises, but would also reveal the true depth of their commitment to the path of redemption they had chosen. The confrontation with adversity had taken an unexpected turn, presenting a challenge that would test not just their business acumen, but the very core of their newfound ethical stance. As the city bustled to life outside, Richard knew that the choices made in this quiet morning hour would echo far beyond the walls of Thomson Enterprises, shaping not just their future, but potentially the landscape of corporate ethics for years to come. As the morning light filtered through the windows of Richard's office, the weight of the decision before them hung heavy in the air. Richard Thomson and John Henderson sat across from each other, the USB drive containing Melissa's explosive evidence lying between them like a ticking time bomb. Richard rubbed his temples, feeling the strain of sleepless nights and constant pressure. "John," he began, his voice hoarse with fatigue, "I can't help but wonder if we're in over our heads. This information, it could save everything we've worked for. But at what cost?" John leaned back in his chair, his eyes filled with a mixture of concern and understanding. "I know, Richard, it's not an easy decision. Using this information would be effective, but it goes against everything we've been trying to build." As they sat in contemplative silence, Sarah knocked on the door, her face etched with worry. "Mr. Thomson, Mr. Henderson, I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's something you need to see." She handed them a tablet open to a live news feed. Robert Carter was standing at a podium, his face a mask of false concern as he addressed a crowd of reporters. "It saddens me deeply," Carter was saying, his voice dripping with insincere regret, "to announce that in light of recent events, the board has voted to remove Richard Thomson as CEO of Thomson Enterprises. While we appreciate his years of service, it's clear that the company needs new leadership to navigate these troubled waters." Richard felt as if the floor had dropped out from beneath him. He had expected opposition, but this swift and decisive move caught him off guard. John's hand on his shoulder steadied him as they continued to watch. Carter went on, outlining his vision for the company's future, a vision that seemed to erase all the progress Richard and John had made towards ethical reform. As the press conference concluded, Richard slumped in his chair, a wave of despair washing over him. "It's over," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "Everything we've worked for, gone in an instant." John leaned forward, his eyes blazing with a determination that cut through Richard's despair. "It's not over, Richard. Not unless we let it be. We still have choices to make." Richard gestured helplessly at the tablet, then at the USB drive. "What choices, John? Carter and the board have outmaneuvered us. We could release Melissa's information, but that would make us no better than them. Or we could walk away, let all our work for change disappear." As Richard spoke, doubt crept into his voice. The idealism that had driven him since his encounter with John on that rainy street corner seemed naive in the face of such ruthless opposition. For a moment, he was tempted to fall back on his old instincts, to fight fire with fire, to use every weapon at his disposal to claw back control. John sensed the internal struggle and leaned in, his voice low and intense. "Richard, remember why we started this. It wasn't about maintaining control or even about the company itself. It was about doing what's right, about leaving a positive mark on the world." Richard stood abruptly, pacing the room as his mind raced. "But what good can we do if we're pushed out, John? How can we affect change if we don't have the power to implement it?" As Richard grappled with his doubts, memories flooded his mind. He remembered the look of betrayal on John's face years ago when he had first taken over the company. He thought of the employees who had reached out in support after his confession, believing in the possibility of change. And he recalled the spark of hope he had seen in Melissa's eyes when she entrusted him with the evidence. John's voice cut through his tumultuous thoughts. Power isn't everything, Richard. Sometimes the most profound changes come from standing firm in our principles, especially when it's difficult. Richard paused by the window, looking out at the city skyline. The empire he had built seemed suddenly small in the face of the moral challenge before him. He thought about the man he had been, the man he had become, and the man he wanted to be. Turning back to John, Richard saw not just his business partner, but a friend who had offered him a second chance at redemption. In that moment, the doubts that had plagued him began to recede, replaced by a calm resolve. "You're right, John," Richard said, his voice gaining strength. "We didn't start this for power or control. We started it to make a difference, to show that business can be both profitable and ethical." He walked back to the desk, picking up the USB drive. "We won't use this information, not like this, but we won't give up either. There has to be a way to expose the truth without compromising our integrity." John stood, a smile of pride and relief on his face. "That's the Richard Thompson I believed in all those years ago. So, what's our next move?" As Richard began to outline a plan, one that would challenge Carter and the board through legal and transparent means, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The path ahead was still uncertain, fraught with obstacles and potential setbacks. But he now understood that true strength lay not in ruthless tactics or unchecked power, but in unwavering commitment to one's principles. The moment of doubt had passed, leaving in its wake a stronger, more resolute Richard Thompson. As he and John dove into the details of their counter-strategy, Richard knew that regardless of the outcome, he was finally becoming the man he had always aspired to be. Little did they know, this decision would set in motion a chain of events that would not only reshape the future of Thompson Enterprises, but would send ripples through the entire business world, challenging long-held notions of corporate ethics and responsibility. In the months that followed, Richard and John's unwavering commitment to ethical business practices sparked a movement that extended far beyond Thompson Enterprises. Their transparent approach to addressing the company's past misdeeds, coupled with their refusal to compromise their newfound principles, resonated with employees, shareholders, and the public alike. Though they faced numerous legal and financial challenges, their integrity ultimately prevailed. Carter's machinations were exposed through legitimate channels, leading to his own downfall. The board, recognizing the shifting tide of public opinion, reinstated Richard as CEO, with John as his partner in steering the company towards a more ethical future. Thompson Enterprises emerged from the crisis not just surviving, but thriving. It became a model for corporate responsibility, inspiring other companies to follow suit. Richard and John's story became a case study in business schools, teaching future leaders about the power of redemption and the importance of ethical leadership. As for Richard, he found that the path of integrity, though difficult, brought a sense of fulfillment he had never known in his previous pursuit of wealth and power. He had not only redeemed himself but had also created a legacy that would positively impact generations to come. Standing at his office window years later, Richard reflected on the journey that had brought him to this point. The cityscape before him was the same, yet everything had changed. He had changed, and in doing so, he had changed the world of business for the better. Thank you very much for listening to this story. Comment below what you thought of the ending and from which city you're listening to us. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more, click on the next story that's appearing on your screen now. Leave your like and subscribe to our channel so we can build a huge community that shares inspiring stories together. See you soon.